First of all, let me say that it's an honor for me to be here with my wife and a few others from Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains, along with our pastor, Dan Ariel, who's sitting on the front row and received his doctorate this morning. As a lifetime Baptist, as a Sunday school teacher since I was 18 years old, as one who has been in glory and also been embarrassed on occasion in the Southern Baptist Convention with its disagreements, it's indeed a pleasure to come here where the motto of this great seminary, keeping the faith, is an inspiration to us all. It's rare that I make a commencement address anymore. It's not that I don't get a few invitations. I just don't accept many of them. And I like to start most of my speeches, at least when I was in politics, by telling a joke. I'm not a very good storyteller. When I first announced my candidacy for president back in 1975, most people in the nation said, well, he doesn't have a chance to win, but he's a Southerner, at least he has a few funny stories to tell. What they didn't realize was it was my successor in the White House who was a great storyteller. But I have to say in complete candor, being in the environment of a religious institution, that on occasion I have been successful as a teller of jokes. I remember the 4 years in the White House, my stories seemed to go over quite well. And then when I left the White House, I lost that ability pretty much. Except on one notable occasion, when I went to China and Japan in 1981. We got to Japan, I was asked to make a few speeches without fee, I might say. One of them was to the graduating class of a small college near Osaka. And when I got there, the audience was about half this large. Everybody was extremely tense. It was the first year after I left the White House as president, and the students and the faculty and the parents were very nervous. And I had a wonderful interpreter from the embassy whom I had known as president. And if you've ever given a statement in English and had it translated into Japanese, you know it takes longer. So I had a very brief talk, but at the last minute, just to put people at ease, I decided to tell a joke. And instead of getting a funny joke, I took a short joke. It was the shortest joke I remembered from my governor's campaign. And I told my joke, and then the interpreter repeated, and the audience just collapsed in laughter. I have never had a better response to a joke in my life. I couldn't wait until the speech was over to get back to the holding room and ask the interpreter, how did you tell my joke? He was very evasive, but I persisted, and finally he ducked his head and looked the other way, and he said, I told the audience, President Carter told a funny story, everybody laughed. So you can see there are some advantages in having been President of the United States. One is being invited here to give this commencement address this morning. I don't have a prepared text, but I have been thinking for quite a number of weeks about what I would share with you. As a Baptist layman, some things have become very troubling and very important to me. We can't take, in our religious faith, anything for granted. I think it's very difficult, at least in my Sunday school class, where we have practically no members of our church. Most of the adults are teaching Sunday school or Sunday school superintendent and so forth. We have a lot of visitors from a diverse religions and places. Only about 1/5 of my average Sunday school class are actually Baptist. And we share, and there's a great deal of contention and probing. What does life mean? What is religion? What is the difference among denominations? Why can't we get along better? And so I think that I tell them quite often that God Almighty can withstand our questioning. We should not be reticent to put forward our own concerns, our own doubts, our own searching for the truth. I tell them also, although I'm not a theologian, that Paul Tillich made a very important statement that impressed itself on me. Paul Tillich said, religion is the search for the truth about our own existence, our relationship with God, our relationship with our fellow human beings. And he went on to say that when we lose the searching nature within ourselves, we lose a major part of our religious commitment. Religion is the search. So searching for our proper role in life, our proper relationship with God and our fellow human beings is an integral part of a dynamic religious faith. I know Southern Baptist in the last few years, that phrase, whenever I tell anybody I'm a Southern Baptist, many of them know it already, it's treated with something of a joke. A Southern Baptist has become equated with schism or divisions or incompatibility. And it's taken away the ancient historic image of us Southern Baptists as those who were dynamic missionaries for Christ in places where we are needed and where the voice of God is seldom heard. That image has changed, but obviously the basic faith, the basic belief, the basic foundations of our life and our own denomination have not changed. How do you deal with this in a modern, secular, fast-changing, technological world? It's not easy for a layman. I know it may be easier for those who have devoted their lives to studying religion or theology and who are much better grounded in the principles of the Bible than it is for me. But it's not easy for me, I know. No matter how we set standards for our life or our performance, personally or professionally among those that we influence, there's no doubt that religion, Christianity, gives us the optimum standard of measuring what we do, the optimum goals for which we should reach. Reinhold Niebuhr, who is my favorite theologian because I know more about him, said that we have two measurements of our lives. I've studied his more because I've been in politics. He wrote a great deal about religion and politics. And he said that in politics, the highest standard that a community can have, the highest standard that a nation can have, is to reach for simple justice. Justice is the epitome of achievement for a nation. I thought about this often when I was governor and when I was president. But for an individual, agape love, sacrificial love, is a higher standard or goal. No one could have expected me as president to make sacrificial love the basic principle of my nation in dealing with other competitive nations and protecting the interests of more than 250 million people. But I know that in my private life, the standards of Christ are sacrificial love. It's not easy to comprehend. It's certainly not easy to apply. I've had a lot of people ask me, what are the biggest problems? What is the incompatibility between your life as a politician and your life as a Christian? And I've thought a lot about this. What is the greatest discrimination with which we should deal as Christians? Because quite often that word discrimination kind of sets for us a framework of our legitimate concerns. I grew up in the South, in Georgia. I'm familiar with racial discrimination. I saw the millstone of segregation around the necks of both black and white citizens, and the liberation that came to us, at least partially, as racism was partially eliminated. Rosen and I have spent a good bit of time negotiating among countries in Africa who are at war within the nations. Sudan, for instance, I've been there many times to Khartoum to meet with the revolutionaries in the South who are Christians. And the government, Muslim government in Khartoum. That's a nation torn apart by discrimination because of religion. The war is horrendous. 260,000 people died there in 1 year, just recently. So discrimination because of race, because of religion are very important. But I think that the main discrimination that afflicts us and indeed the entire world these days is the discrimination of rich people against poor people. Who are the rich people? Who are the rich people? Everyone in this room is a rich person. A rich person is one who has a home, who has a family and you know where they are, who has a modicum of education, a decent chance for a job, enough to eat, some degree of health care, some hope for the future. You believe that the police are on your side. You believe that if you make a decision, it'll make a difference, at least in your own life. Many people have none of those things. They are the poor. Where do they live? Obviously in Bangladesh, and in Addis Ababa, and in Lusaka, and in Bangkok, yes, but they also live next door to us, as they did in the time of Christ. They were his neighbors. They were the ones to whom he reached out. Where does a church fit into this alleviation of discrimination or mirroring the life of Christ that was devoted to eliminating discrimination? Although this word is not used, so far as I know, very much in the Bible. He reached out to those who felt discrimination, to the abandoned, to the scorned, to the despised, to those who suffered from illnesses like leprosy that a whole society believed were caused by the sin of the leper. That's what the church should remember as a major cause. I've been a politician. People say, what is the difference between religion and politics? What is the incompatibility? I've never really found any serious incompatibility, but I tell you this, and you won't like it. Politicians do a lot more to end discrimination against the poor than the churches do. There is a driving force in the political world to find out how can I do a better job in improving the life of the poor? How can I improve education? How can I alleviate suffering? How can I deal with hunger? How can I clothe the naked? How can I give shelter to the homeless? How can I provide equality? How can I deal with human rights abuses, civil rights abuses? How can I open my arms as a politician to all those who are different from me? And it's a highly competitive world, I tell you. A candidate who comes forward with a better idea in doing these things will be elected. There's no place for complacency. You're always in a competition. The next election is coming along. Unfortunately, we don't have that all that much in the church. Where is the competition between one church and another to alleviate the suffering of the poor? The measurements of churches quite often competitively is how do we measure our growth in the budget? How do we measure how many new members we've gotten? How do we measure the coverage of our TV program or radio program on Sunday morning? But the relationship between a typical congregation and the poverty-stricken neighbors quite often is almost lacking. We don't know who the poor are. How many of you, how many of my own circle of friends or my family know a genuinely poor person who has no home or who is hungry, who has no prospect for a better education or a job? You see, the point is, we cannot afford to be complacent, but quite often we are. We tend to form as a human nature, and I'm guilty of it too, a homogeneous group around me, people that are like me, that I know and with whom I feel at ease. And there's a great deal of self-congratulations just because I am a church member. Just because I go to church and listen to a sermon and teach a Sunday school lesson, I feel very complacent. These things trouble me as a layman. And I know there's a great deal of incompatibility in our denomination and in others too. What is the thrust of a ministry that's viable and admirable? Preaching is great. We must have the Word of God. But that's not enough. . I would be the last one to hold myself up as a model because I've been guiltier than you have. I've been the president of this nation. I've been the governor of Georgia. And I tell you, I have learned things just the last few months about my neighbors in Georgia I never knew before. The Carter Center has a great ministry in Africa. We're responsible at the Carter Center for immunizing all the world's children, working with the World Health Organization, with UNICEF, with the Rotary Clubs that give vaccine for polio and so forth. We have tens of thousands of small farmers in Africa in a Carter Center program to increase the production of food grain because the level of food in Africa has steadily gone down. We deal with crises and with wars. We negotiate ceasefires. We hold elections. And that's been a very self-congratulatory spirit for me. I've said that many times. You can tell by the way the words flow out. But less than 6 months ago, we finally faced the question, what are you doing about your next-door neighbors in Atlanta, Georgia? Atlanta's a great city, beautiful, rapidly growing skyline. The Olympics are coming in 1996. The Braves were the National League champions last year. But we are now beginning to see we've got two Atlantas. I've described one of them. The other one is one we tend to ignore. And it's not just the political leaders that ignore this other Atlanta. We've identified those that suffer most. We used two criteria to identify the families that we wanted to serve in this new project. We just call it very simply the Atlanta Project. I hope eventually it'll be an America Project. But the two criteria was the percentage of families with one parent, and the other one was the number of child mothers. These are the same families that have the highest level of school dropouts, of teenage pregnancy, of poverty, of homelessness, of unemployment. They live where the crime rate is highest, where the drug culture flourishes. And it's part of Atlanta. It's the other Atlanta that the Chamber of Commerce doesn't want to talk about. We found over 500,000 people in this one area, about 15% of the total population. We're trying to address their needs, and we now have divided this into 20 different communities, and each one of us leaders, about half black, half white leaders, some tenant leaders from the government housing projects, not all wealthy at all. We go to these communities, and for the first time in my life, I have to admit to you, I have been trying to learn about a whole broad community of people who are totally different from me. I don't mean just racially, but totally different from the wealthy status of my life. I don't have time to go into detail. I just like to give you one example. I went to one of the schools. We go to the schools. We go to the housing projects. We visit the policemen on the corners trying to deal with the drug traffic. We go into the places where there are health clinics or where there ought to be health clinics. There are no Boy Scout troops. There are no Little League ball teams. This is part of Atlanta. And one of the earliest schools I visited was a Martin Luther King Jr. middle school because of a famous name. And I visited the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. Bright kids, well-dressed, better dressed than any of my children ever were when they went to school. And I asked them questions and talked to them. They were very bright. They knew that Jimmy Carter was the 39th president. They knew Jimmy Carter was from Georgia. They knew the year that I was elected in 1976. They even knew the name of my wife. They didn't believe I was Jimmy Carter. Until the principal showed them a photograph, and then they believed it. But they burst forth. They asked me questions I never heard before. I've been the governor of this community. One girl said, "Mr. President, why do old people lose Social Security?" I said, "Honey, you're mistaken. Old people don't lose Social Security once they get it unless their income goes up too high at certain age groups." She said, "Yes, sir." I said, "You're mistaken, honey." She said, "No, sir, you're mistaken. My granddaddy lost Social Security." And I said, I really don't see how that's possible." She said, "He lives under a bridge in West Atlanta, and he cut off his payments because he didn't have a mailing address. Later, I asked the principal, what are the biggest problems in this school for you? She said, the boys feel that their only avenue to success, to esteem, to recognition among their peers is to own a semi-automatic weapon. I said, what about the girls? She said, pregnancy. I said, yes, I know. I've heard about teenage pregnancy. She said, Mr. President, the worst problem is in the 6th grade. And I couldn't believe it. I said, I've got a granddaughter, 12 years old. That's hard for me to believe. Why are the 6th graders more afflicted with pregnancy than the 7th and 8th? She said, I don't think you want to know. I said, yes, I do. She said, there are really 4 reasons. The pimps and the drug pushers prefer sex with little girls. Secondly, they're cheaper. Third, they're not as able to defend themselves. And fourth, they're not as likely to have AIDS. Yeah, that's not Lusaka. And that's not Addis Ababa. That's not Bangkok. That's Atlanta, Georgia. It's a world that we do not know. But it's a world by God through Christ that we should know intimately. In closing, let me say, I don't think we're going to heal the rift among Baptists by semantical or philosophical or theological debate. You know, we're not going to convince some people that the earth was created 4,004 BC, or whether evolution is applicable, or whether the earth is flat or round, or whether stars can actually fall from the heavens and land on the earth. We're never going to do things like that. But I think all Baptists, regardless of ultra-conservatism or extreme liberalism or fundamentalist or moderate, can find a common ground in dealing church by church, believer by believer, minister by minister, with the poorest among us, whom we now rarely know. There are obviously some great exceptions, and I don't want to stigmatize all those who are doing wonderful work among the poor. But that is a rarity, I tell you. It's a rarity. And it ought not be a rarity. How can we stimulate Christians to reach out in a spirit of self-sacrifice, in a spirit of service, just to communicate with those around us? It's not all that difficult. We have a young couple that go from Maranatha Baptist Church, and now they've been in a foreign in Togo for more than 10 years. He's not a preacher. He's an agricultural specialist. Jerome Etheridge and his wife Joanne. They went to a remote village. He digs wells through a grant from Baptist in North Carolina. Last time I talked to him, he'd dug more than 120 wells. This eradicates horrible diseases like guinea worm that comes from drinking filthy water. And it also, he is starting a program so they don't have to plow themselves. They can use oxen. He breeds oxen, and he gives oxen, a pair of oxen, to the key people, and he teaches them how to care for the oxen. This particular area was separated from the rest of Togo by a river that flooded about 3 or 4 months a year, so that people were totally isolated from the rest of the nation. He built a bridge across a major river. One Southern Baptist missionary. And his wife teaches the villagers about preventive health care. She acts almost like a nurse or a doctor in that area. There's no doubt that their words mean a lot in evangelizing the residents of Togo, but their actions combined with words are what exemplify the teachings of Jesus Christ. There's another well-known program that I would mention just in passing. Rosa and I, every year, along with Brother Dan and Ariel and some others from many of you, we spend 1 week a year, we don't strain ourselves, building homes, working side by side with the poorest families in America and Habitat for Humanity, which started at Koinonia Farms. And we go among people who quite often are stigmatized as despicable, as without ambition, lazy, little vision. If they had vision and ambition, if they worked hard like us, right, they wouldn't sleep in a pasteboard box or under a plastic sheet or in a home with a holey roof. But we work side by side with these people, and the most startling thing about it is that they are just as intelligent, just as hardworking, just as ambitious, love their kids just as much as I do. And just having a decent home transforms their lives. People who you hear referred to often as welfare cases who've never finished high school, and in 3 or 4 generations they move into a Habitat home that's decent, which they help to build. And within 2 or 3 weeks, they are planning which college their kids will attend. This, to me, is a kind of ministry of Christians that can bring us together, Baptists together. And the wealthy, like all of us, and our poor neighbors together. That, to me, is what we should emphasize even more. And maybe not that same model, but similar to it. In the last 4 or 5 weeks, some of you have the same Sunday school lessons I do. We've been teaching about the resurrection in Corinthians. And I was turning over my Bible last night to 2 Corinthians, and I noticed the people there in Corinth asked Paul, what is the basis for eternity? And Paul reminded them that things that are eternal are the things you cannot see. I think it's in the 4th chapter of 2 Corinthians. This is something that is difficult to encompass. What are the things you can't see? A house? An automobile? Headlines in a newspaper? Bank account? Those are the things to which we devote ourselves too much. The size of a congregation? I don't mean that any of those things are bad, and I'm sure Paul didn't either. But Paul said the things that are eternal that you cannot see are the things also that don't change. The things that Christ personified in his brief ministry on earth. Understanding, communication, service, meekness, justice, truth, compassion, and love. Those words of Paul describing Christ are the guide for us in dealing with the modern day challenges, and I would rather say opportunities of a Christian. Those words, that example, those standards, life priorities of Christ can bring us together. And I pray, God, that this will come to pass.